Hola, hola amigos, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo andan? Espero que todo bien. Bueno, hoy después de bastante tiempo volvemos con una reacción a un video. Algunos de ustedes me lo habían mencionado y dije, bueno, como es un tema que suele llamar la atención, que hemos tratado de más de una oportunidad, disculpen, podríamos ver qué tiene para decir este canal que, bueno, yo descubrí hace muy poquito llamado Barbies, ¿ok? El video se titula Esto es por lo que odias el metal moderno. Imagino que hablará de todo el metal, bien o mal llamado Octane Core, ¿no? O post-core, ¿no? Estas bandas que reposan mucho más, bueno, en el machaque, en el sonido electrónico, etcétera. De hecho, la miniatura dice, encuentro tu falta de riffs, muy molesta, o algo así. Entonces vamos a ver el canal e ir comentando un poco qué es lo que me va apareciendo el video de este canal Barbies. Voy a dejar el original en la descripción completo para que lo vean. Vamos a arrancar, a ver qué es lo que tiene para decirnos el señor Barbie, si es que se llama así, ¿no?
Well, hello, my friends. We meet again. It's been a while.
Arre que le tengo que poner subtítulos. Bueno, vamos a arrancar por lo primero, poniéndole subtítulos y en español, ¿sí? Para que, bueno, ustedes, lógicamente, si no saben inglés, puedan entender de qué va. Entonces, con ese motivo, yo me debería poner mejor arriba para que ustedes puedan leer. Bueno, dicho esto, ahora sí, esperen que aún súcate, continuamos.
Where should we begin? Octane core is a derisive
Bueno,
term used to describe when a band, usually of the metalcore variety, makes music designed to appeal to listeners of the satellite radio station Octane. Now, this radio station Octane is usually just used as a metaphor to represent people are on the periphery of metal, I guess you could say, right? Quote unquote.
che, usó el término gente que está en la periferia del metal, ¿eh? No vaya a ser cosa que nos esté copiando la terminología, amigo Barbies. ¿Habrá llegado la palabra periférico a algún tipo de youtuber de metal angloparlante? Qué loco, ¿no? Pero bueno, mira, hace la comparación que dice, básicamente, metalcore, perdón, octanecore, a ver si me da un poquito más chiquito, metal moderno, riffs simples, versos muy suaves, coro masivo y una mezcla de voces limpias y rotas, y si los subtítulos dice, capaz un breakdown, capaz. Bueno, continuemos.
Quote, more normies, I suppose you could say. Essentially, Octane is just like an alternative
¿Qué
metal
para los
station.
normies? Ejemplos de Octane Core, ¿eh? A ver, para. Hasta ahí, comparte un poquito. Hay una cantidad de ejemplos
But to me,
zarpada.
viewing this shift in sound of a lot of metalcore is a very shallow and myopic view on this phenomenon, which has been going on for probably around a decade or so. And I think the main distinction really comes down to what is the main focus and hook of the songs. Is it the riffs? Or is it the vocals? So let me break it down like this for you guys. I will be picking on the band Architects, Metallica, and In Flames today, not only because they are some of my favorite bands of all time, but because I also happen to really enjoy their more vocally focused, or I guess in the sense of Architects, octane core sounding albums. So let's get into it here. In metal and by and large hardcore, but this video is centered around metal because that's what I like, I would very...
O sea, por lo que entendí, dijo que le gusta más lo que es porque habló de Metallica, In Flames y bueno, Architects. Imagino que va a usar a Metallica e In Flames como bandas más riferas. Habría que ver cómo que usa In Flames, pero creo que le gusta más la parte más octane core de Architects, por ejemplo. Es interesante, a ver.
Scientifically peer-reviewed studies say that the distinction of hooks that the song is built upon, right? The hook, that is the thing that captures your ear, which you come back to listen to, right? In metal is at minimum 50-50 split of riffs and vocals being the main hook. Here we will also count breakdowns and solos as riffs for the purposes of this video. I would say that in metal, it's easily a 50-50 split of focus, and that is sort of like the bare minimum that I think a lot of metalheads enjoy. And depending on the band and genre, I would say the split can go even like 60-40 riffs, or even like 80 to 20% riffs for more of the really riff-dependent genres and bands, such as like melodic death metal or like thrash metal, or the really...
Bueno, igual acá, claro, porque dice que obviamente en el metal uno necesita que haya una gran preponderancia de riffs por sobre las voces, por eso en estos gráficos que él muestra el porcentaje de riffs es mayor. Acá y pone la división en el metal o el metalcore más viejo, Y acá, bueno, pone 60-40, u otro ejemplo puede ser hasta 80-20,
and
¿no?
genres and bands, such as like melodic death metal or
Como
like
el
thrash
melodeath,
metal, right? Those are all
thrash.
very riff focused genres, right? The riffs are what you come for, and the riffs are what you stay and come back and listen to, right? The vocals are almost sort of added, not as like an afterthought, but as more of like a texture thing to communicate words and feelings associated with these riffs, right? The riffs, regardless, metal riffs are what you tune in for.
Sí. Incluso un tema como Doomsday estaba bien riffero.
Now, pop music is almost 100% vocally focused, right? In pop music, the singing, the words that are being communicated are what you come to listen for, and the background instrumentals are sort of just the canvas upon which the vocals are painted upon, right? In metal, it's very different, right? You stay for the instruments and you stay for the riffs most of the time, right? And so when bands go Octane core, they change their split of riffs. Let's say they were 60 to 40% riffs before, and they swing their bass line of focus to be much more vocally centered, right? You want the vocals to be the highlight, right? In a very sort of like pop sounding way, but that's not a bad thing inherently, right? I would say a lot of Octane core bands, probably more like 40 to 60% vocals. Some even going higher, like Bad Omens, you could probably even say they're like 90-10%, right? Vocals. A lot of people call this phenomenon when metalcore bands do this Octane core, but previous...
Hablando un poco de todo lo que dice de que el metal tienen que ser solamente riffs o el punto principal tienen que ser los riffs, yo estoy bastante de acuerdo con eso. Tal vez no a un porcentaje tan elevado como cuando se mandó un 80-20, porque por ejemplo vos escuchás un montón de bandas tipo Maiden, tipo, no sé, mucho de metal de los 80s incluso, heavy, hard rock, glam, eran muy rifferos, pero también había una gran importancia de las voces, sobre todo para los estribillos, ¿no? Vos no te imaginás un tema de Maiden prácticamente sin un buen estribillo. Son muy importantes los riffs, muy importantes los solos, por supuesto, pero sin un buen estribillo y un buen cantante, además, es medio loco. Y sí es cierto, bueno, vos escuchaste el tema este de Bad Omens que puso recién el flaco, y bueno, está la guitarra distorsionada, pero es un acorde muy simple. Y además hay que ver si menciona algo también de la homogeneización, como se diga esa palabra de mierda, de las voces, ¿no? Que suenan todas muy parecidas. Vamos a ver qué más agrega.
People would call this, quote unquote, selling out in a very vicious
Antes lo hubiera llamado, claro, venderse. Capaz habla de
This is how they would
acá,
say a band switched from riffs to vocals. And I would say that this shift in priority of the song is what really turns off a lot of the more traditional metal crowd, right? As it seems that one of the primary distinctions between metalheads and I guess you would say normies, right, is that metalheads are here for the riffs. Of course, you're probably here for some of the vocal hooks, and that's why it's not 100% riffs, right?
Bueno.
You also want some vocal hooks, right? But metalheads want riffs.
Lo que recién mencionaba.
People who like pop music like vocals, right? Vocals are the communicator of words and thus easily digestible emotions and feelings associated with music. But for those of us baptized in the metal holy water, so to speak, we also like riffs and view these as essentially equals in terms of interest and the way that they communicate emotions,
bueno, lo que dijimos recién.
feelings, and expressions, right? So I hope this is all making sense so far. People who like metal like riffs and view them as equal to vocals, but pop, Octane core, whatever you want to call it, focus is more or less completely on the vocals. Now, I did say I would pick on Architects, and don't worry, we will, but the most successful, quote-unquote, selling out or going Octane core of all time would, of course, be Metallica, right? And Justice for All and the Black Album released just over 3 years apart, but the change in focus of the music could not be more apparent. And Justice for All still has catchy vocal moments, right? Don't get me wrong, but I would say that it is much, much, much more riff focused than the Black Album. It's probably like 70 to 30% for riffs, right? And even a song like One, which is the most vocally focused song probably on that album, right, is still like 60 to 40% riffs. Then just a few years later, Metallica would release the Black Album, which of course we all know would go on to be the biggest metal album ever, and even one of the highest selling albums ever, period. And why was this? Well, of course they quote unquote sold out as any BO smelling, camo short wearing, intensely loyal to the riff metal diehard would say. However, I would counter that and maybe make a more cohesive argument.
Sí, es verdad. Bueno, vamos a ver cuál es el resto del argumento que hace, pero aún así, cuando compara Justice con el Black Album, por más de que es evidente que hay más riffs en Justice o en discos anteriores, más rápidos, sigue siendo un álbum muy llevado adelante por los riffs, el álbum negro, ¿eh? Salvo Nothing Else Matters, que tiene un arpegio, o The Unforgiven. Pero hasta Unforgiven tiene charara, como que hace un unísono con la voz el riff también. No deja, no, en muy pocos momentos está Metallica como haciendo el rasgueo o el strumming de un acorde, ¿no?
That they simply changed where the focus of the music lies. The Black Album still has tons and tons of great riffs, right? Don't get me wrong. But the main hooks of this album is the vocals.
Yo tiraría un 50-50 como mucho.
I would say it's easily more of like a 40 to 60% split in vocals here. Maybe even a bit more skewed towards the vocals in some songs, right? It is clear that the vocals and the words being spoken are for the most part what draws the listener into these songs, right? You don't tune in to the Black Album for the riffs, you tune in for the great choruses and great singing, right? It's this change in focus that I believe alienates a lot of the people who like riffs more, traditional metalheads, I guess you could say, but because they couldn't really find a very cogent or coherent argument as to why they didn't like this new change in sound, they simply just say they sold out, right? They went pop, which essentially, right, they just changed the focus from a more metal split in focus to a more pop, vocally focused split. I think a large reason why this focus changes is twofold.
Sí, puede ser. Yo también lo que menciono ahora, así no me gana de mano si es que lo llega a decir, que también tomo mucho como este tipo de Octane Core, como menciona él, o lo que fuere, son esas bandas que el riff únicamente es chucum, chucu, chucu, chun, 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 chucu, chucu, chun, chun, chun. No, un simple gent sin aportar, pero absolutamente más nada, y es pasar de algo así a un verso suave, como dice, y a un estribillo grandilocuente. Como yo percibo, por ejemplo, la mutación de una banda a día de hoy como Orbit Culture, ¿no? No creo que la mencione. Es más, por algunos ejemplos de riffs que estuvo poniendo, tal vez esos riffs él los considera como riffs, y bueno, técnicamente son riffs, pero para mí también es un poco matar la esencia del riff, donde vos tenés literalmente un montón de trastes en el mástil de la guitarra para explorar y solamente te quedás machacando uno de manera sincopada con la batería. Ahí también uno podría poner el ejemplo de que Slayer lo hacía y demás, pero bueno, con un montón de otros shades, ¿no? Como lo hacía Slayer. Bueno, para no enredarme más, seguimos.
Here. Let's move back to metalcore away from Metallica. So yeah, first you get like a small taste of success, right? A band releases a couple albums, some of the songs get popular, and it's usually the most vocally driven song, right? This leads the band to chase more of that. And why not? Why not give the audience what it wants? Well, of course, getting more success, notoriety, and of course money also helps, right? I think this happens around the same time, you know, third album or so, these bands are introduced to producers, to the record labels, usually have a small or even large role in the band's sound. You usually have an ear more tuned to a more quote-unquote traditional, like vocally focused style. I also think that success breeds relative comfort for these bands, right? Maybe the band isn't so
Estoy muy de acuerdo con lo de los productores, definitivamente. Hay dos que bueno, producen y para mí ya es una señal medio... me prende un poquito las alarmas. No me acuerdo el nombre. Es más, se lo voy a buscar ahora en el momento, del productor de los últimos discos de Ice Nine Kills y todo eso. Yo leo ese nombre y realmente es alerta de saturación. Se te van a romper los oídos. Y el otro, con el respeto que merece, y eso que me gusta la banda, pero es Jordan Fish. Jordan Fish, mamita, qué sonido totalmente destructivo a los discos. Pero bueno, el productor es Drew Fulk también. Ese productor que hace un montón de este tipo de discos, ay.
Financial anymore. You know, that eases a lot of stress for a lot of people. The bands, you know, they also get older. Maybe their music taste changes.
Bueno, perdón, es cuando él dice que tal vez una banda va evolucionando, pegan un par de discos que funcionan bien, un par de éxitos en la radio, o en general, en redes, lo que sea, y que tal vez para mutar un poco una compañía o un productor vienen y le dan una vueltita de rosca más comercial al sonido, ¿no?
Well, feelings sort of begin to soften. You become more of like a more rounded person, right? All these things add up and combine to produce people who are simply just not as angry anymore. I hesitate to say not as hungry because that burning hunger for success can simply shift aim. But if you are, 30 years old, maybe you have a kid and a family, decent paying music job, you're simply just probably not as angry as you were when you were 21, broken single playing in a band, right? So you don't want to just write all these crazy riffs and all these breakdowns. You want to do something better and bigger, and that really most of the time involves vocally focused songs. And that
Bueno, eso es muy cierto que le pasa a un montón de artistas también, ¿eh? Y que incluso podrían volver un poco a sus raíces y que sí, y que yo estoy seguro que sería muy bien recibido y que no lo hacen. El caso de Metallica, por ejemplo, es muy notorio. Y un caso muy notorio también, yendo al plano nacional, es Rata Blanca, ¿no? Rata, que ya lo hemos hablado, que más de una vez a Giardino le han preguntado por qué no vuelve a hacer metal neoclásico y no sé qué. Él dice que ahora, ya en este punto de su carrera, le gusta más hacer hard rock y heavy tradicional, así muy, muy rockero, sin mucha complejidad, ¿no? Que lo podría seguir tocando lo viejo, por supuesto, pero por ahí le llama un poco más la atención eso otro, ¿no? Bueno, y esto que dice también es cierto que muchos artistas tal vez van perdiendo un poco ese hambre de comerse el mundo que tenían cuando arrancaban. De nuevo, el caso de Metallica es muy ad hoc. Y bueno, puede pasar también ya en bandas de estos tipos de estilos, ¿no?
that is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And this, of course, is to say nothing at all about pressure from record labels to chase higher numbers, which is like another video topic altogether. Go back and look at all these bands which went octane core or pop, whatever you want to call it, right? And you will see a lot of these commonalities, right? Bands have been established for a while. Maybe they're sort of like in that middle tier bands. They want to move to that next level, right? So they simply move to a more vocally focused product because that's how they know they will reach more people. Of course, I just also have to stress and say that there's nothing inherently wrong with having vocally focused metal. Some of my favorite metal ever made is very vocally focused. Looking at you, power metal. And I love country music, along with my fair share of pop, which is like entirely vocally focused, right? Let's take a look at another band that was always been accused of selling out and becoming quote unquote pop.
In Flames,
of course, here just means vocally focused. And that, of course, would be the band In Flames. In Flames definitely had a slower and more gradual shift, I think you could say, than a lot of other bands. But if you were to take an album like The Just a Race, right, which, let's be honest, is probably like 10% riffs, to be honest, right? It's very, very riff focused. And then compare it to an album like Come Clarity 10 years later, it is very, very obvious that Come Clarity is a more vocally focused song. And just because you liked something a band did which is much more riff focused does not mean you're going to like something that's more vocally focused, right? You might like another band that's more vocally focused, but that's because you like that particular singer or whatever they do, right? Just because a band does one thing and then they change.
Que de todos modos es como un poco el caso de Metallica también, ¿no? Porque In Flames se vendió, entre comillas, un poco a lo que era el metalcore americano, siendo una banda sueca, por supuesto, de esa época, pero era un metalcore muy llevado adelante por Riffs, ¿eh? Come Clarity, Route to Remain, esos dos puntualmente son álbumes que se nota que hay un poco más de intención, de que los estribillos sean más gancheros. Anders mejora mucho de manera expresiva con las voces. Hay más electrónica, etcétera, pero aún sigue siendo bastante rifero. No a comparación de Just a Race, obviamente, pero sigue siendo bastante rifero si vos lo comparás con lo que pasa hoy con un Bad Omens, ¿no?
Do another thing doesn't mean that you have to like that new thing, right? This is really a quote-unquote problem for bands who have most of their vocals focused on harsh vocals, which a lot of 2010s metalcore was, right? The main vocals were harsh, right? Clean vocals, in addition to having words and rhythm, also contain melody. Melody, which is something that harsh vocals do not contain. So writing very catchy, vocally focused, harsh vocal songs is just much more inherently difficult, right? It's not impossible. A lot of bands have done great sounding, very vocally focused, hooky, harsh vocal songs, right? But it's a lot easier to just introduce clean vocals. And I think that is one thing that octane core bands usually do that turns a lot of people off, is introducing harsh vocals. Maybe
Sí.
not done all that well.
Sí, hay bandas que realmente, digo, uno lleva tantos años escuchándolas con voces rotas y demás y te das cuenta de por qué, si bien son muy grandes, nunca pudieron dar el salto absolutamente gigante que dieron bandas como Bring Me, ¿no? Una se me ocurre mucho es Lamb of God, por ejemplo. Lamb of God, en el caso de haber incluido voces limpias en algún momento y de haber hecho algo así, para mí hubiera llegado muchísimo más allá de lo que llegó. Obviamente a costas de que se le critique el sonido, se vendieron, ¿no? Entre otras cosas, pero es un caso que se me ocurre dentro de todo, de banda que podría haber mutado a ese estilo, pero no lo logró del todo, ¿no?
Or maybe like way overly produced in a sense, right? I think In Flames, this is a big problem with In Flames that a lot of people had, right? They introduced clean vocals and they just didn't really like Anders' clean singing, right? And you know, you can like whatever you like, right? But obviously it was successful for them, but for people who like the more riff-focused stuff, it was just sort of not their thing.
El principal problema con el Octane Core, la gente viene por los riffs y los breakdowns inicialmente solo por el foco de cambiar mucho más hacia las voces.
And one last thing I want to point out that I think makes people sort of roll their eyes at a band when they go in a new direction and become Octane Core is this sort of like half-assed or half-hearted sort of obligatory heavy moment or breakdown, right? There are tons and tons of these examples out there. Sort of just feels like the band knows that they're expected to be heavy in a part.
Voy a tomar esto como lo que él dice, o como lo que yo decía antes de los momentos de chum, 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 que no son obviamente en todo el tema, pero que, claro, obligatoriamente tenés eso en un montón de las bandas de Octane Core. Para mí el último disco de Architects es el ejemplo perfecto, es el engañabobos máximo, pero para mí, con respeto. Y bueno, el resto obviamente acordes, vocecitas melódicas, etc.
So they just sort of fart out a breakdown, uninspired, say, oh, there you go, here's your breakdown. You know, often it also consists of like not screaming or regular harsh vocals, but the vocalist or singer will like sing something or shout something, and then after it is recorded, they will just manually distort the vocals. I, for one, really kind of dislike this. Not only does the after distorted vocals usually
¿Qué? Eso no sabía.
the vocals. I, for one, think, and then after it is recorded, they will.
O sea, claro, el momento típico antes de un breakdown, ¿eh? Te voy a romper la cabeza, tum, 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 por ejemplo, ¿no? Y él dice que en lugar de distorsionar esas voces, el chabón las graba y luego las distorsiona. Yo no sé si sea así.
Distort the vocals. I, for one, really kind of dislike this. Not only does the after distorted vocals usually sound.
O sea, sí se nota que hay a veces mucho efecto, mucho filtro, pero yo creo que el chabón igual la saca con gutural cuando hace eso.
But the breakdown often just feels sort of out of place. And they probably move on from it too fast.
Bueno, en el President hay dos o tres de esos ejemplos, ¿no?
You can't have too much focus on a
que hemos
breakdown.
estado hablando
I don't know,
de...
it just sort of feels very phony. I'd rather band just not do it if they're just not going to do it well, I guess, right? So let's get back to Architects here. To me, like the poster boys of that Octane Core shift in sound. And that's not to say like I don't like their Octane Core stuff. In fact, I really liked For Those Who Wish to Exist and The Sky, the Earth, and All Between. I'm not a big fan of classic Symptoms of Broken Spirit, but Architects really were a very riff-focused band, especially through the 2010s when their series of albums, like the Holy Trinity of Metalcore, I like to call it, right? Lost Forever, Lost Together, All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us, and Holy Hell. Those are all very riff-focused and breakdown-focused albums.
Y antes ni te digo, antes tenía más, porque este disco es bárbaro. Pero antes era mucho más riffero Architect.
Of course, they have their vocal focused moments, right? Gone with the Wind is a really good example of that. Royal Beggars, that's another example of a very vocally focused song. That song in particular sort of set the template for, I think, a lot of the Octane Core sound, right? But by and large, those three albums are very vocally focused. Then when you move on to 2020s, For Those Who Wish to Exist, that's when the main shift comes, right? It shifts to being much more vocally focused, focusing right on Sam Carter and his great singing voice. What a better person to put the real spotlight on, you know what I mean? But it's like this shift in focus that I think really drove a lot of the fans who were a fan of that previous sound away. They were there for the riffs, the breakdowns, the blez, and instead you get a song like Dead Butterflies or Meteor, right, which is all centered on the vocals. That's not to say those songs are bad. I love Dead Butterflies. I think that's one of the best songs that Architects ever put out. But to me, I can definitely see why if you were a metal fan and you liked your riffs, you liked your breakdowns, this come out all vocally focused, you might not like it as much. Now, classic Symptoms of Broken Spirit, I think, is sort of like when it goes too far, right? You know, you go too far away from the riffs and you kind of don't have any metalcore DNA left in you, right? It really sort of loses all its edge. That's not to say there are a lot of other problems with that album, but I'm not really going to get into it, right? But then they sort of brought it back to the Sky, the Earth, and All Between. That's a very, very balanced album in terms of riffs and vocals, I think. It does a really, really good job of being that Octane core, but sort of balancing it, I guess. They gave you the heavy too, but they actually gave you the heavy parts.
Con todo respeto, creo que con este muchacho que es un gran video, está buenísimo. Toda la parte de las voces y los riffs, estoy muy de acuerdo porque está por terminar. Hay un punto más que yo le agregaría a todo esto, que un disco como The Sky, The Earth and All Between de Architects, que para mí es uno de los peores discos que ha salido este año, solamente por el hecho de volver o de hacerlo un poco más pesado que el anterior, de que suene más heavy, de que la producción sea más rimbombante y demás, no le quita lo genérico a todos los riffs, que realmente, a mi entender, o sea, de una banda con tanta experiencia, tan experimentada como Architects, el tema de sacar riffs así de chon, 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 todo el tiempo, a comparación de los riffs que sacaban antes, mucho más sincopados, con cromatismos, ¿no? Subiendo y bajando mucho más es muy, muy diferente a lo que se presenta en el último disco, y además vos le sumás esa carga total de lo que es el Octane Core. También una cosa que podría haber mencionado es el tema del minutaje de las canciones, ¿no? De que todo es muy cortito. Es otra similitud que tiene este tipo de metal con el pop, de que en 3 minutos y medio ya te despachaste una canción, cuando normalmente los temas de metal tienen un poco más de desarrollo, ¿no? Porque vos tenés que presentar el riff, presentar una idea, una estructura. Como vos te acercás un poco a lo que es la fórmula del pop, de querer que las voces sean protagónicas, hasta por ahí podés arrancar con el estribillo directamente, ¿no?
And then just sort of half-ass fart them out. And they also did something interesting too as well on that, on songs like Elegy and Chandelier. They kind of moved into like a very EDM focused sound, right? With like a big build up to like a big drop, essentially. I thought that was very cool, and maybe that's something that Octane Core will morph into in the future. So yeah, just to rephrase here, right? When a band goes Octane Core, they are changing their focus from riffs to vocals. And maybe this will help you when you make your own music think of how you want to focus on your songs. You want to be a riff focused band or vocally focused band? Anyways, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. Leave that down below. Do you agree?
Bueno, el video está muy bien, realmente bastante interesante. Yo le faltaron esos algunos puntitos que mencioné, que obviamente son para mí, ¿no? Son lo que yo pienso, como yo lo veo, pero que el video de esta persona está bastante bien pensado, bien evidenciado, con buenos ejemplos. Se entiende cuando él quiere comparar con Metallica, con In Flames, de que en ciertos momentos la banda perjudicaron un poco el riff a costa de las voces o los ganchos, pero bueno, creo que ya igual aporté bastante de lo que tenía para ir metiendo bocado ahí durante el video. ¿Qué opinan de todo esto? ¿Les parece que es el gran problema? ¿Les parece que hay otro gran problema con el metal moderno? Bueno, los leo y les mando un abrazo muy grande. Hasta luego, chau.